Well, today I absolutely adore talking with Ethan Nelson over at Being Conscious. His Substack, he's a fantastic writer. I love the subjects that he covers. I love the threads that he brings together. Discussions with Mr. Nelson are a complete thrill. I've had the pleasure of speaking with him twice on his podcast. So I had to pull him in and bring him over here to the OG Rose conversation. So Mr. Nelson, thank you for coming today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
It's really great to have you. Mr. Nelson, as I was just saying, you're a tremendous writer. I really like the way that you bring your lines of thought together. I think the way you integrate, say, the thoughts of other thinkers, other philosophers, so on and so forth, into your argument, it never feels poured in from the top. You know, sometimes when you read texts that are dealing with big subjects, it can feel like the person's like, oh, shoot, I need to reference Plato. Oh, I need to get a Freud in there, or whatever. And it's just kind of forced in. And the threads don't really match. It feels like you're just meeting an academic quota or something like that. But when you read your work, it's all threaded together into a very beautiful quilt, a very mosaic, it all flows and it all works together. And it's about topics that matter. The piece that you put out recently that I really liked on expanding our notions of freedom in society. Freedom is one of those words that people hear and everyone goes, oh, I know what that means. I know what freedom is. But those are actually precisely the terms that you're most sure you know what they mean. You probably don't know what they mean. They've become invisible to you. Like Heidegger talks about a working doorknob as something invisible. You only notice it when it breaks. And then you notice the doorknob. In some respects, terms like freedom, you could go justice, you could talk about the good, you could talk, we can go on and on. They're precisely terms that we almost need to intentionally kind of break in our consciousness so that we notice them and we break our everyday relation to them so that we think about them anew. And freedom is definitely one of those concepts. And so what inspired the piece on expanding our notions of freedom? And before you get into that, please tell me, what made you want to start becoming conscious? What made you interested in doing that subject? And feel free to link those together however you like, Mr. Nelson. And again, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, awesome question. Well, I'll just start out with like why I started it is like we've spoken a little bit about writing as a way of formulating thought. And so I think what I find the most inspiration in putting out a newsletter on a semi-regular basis is having an outlet to digest information, to make meaning out of all the different things I'm reading, and to like really, do the creative act of like actually synthesizing different topics. I find that writing for me is like the only outlet where I'm like actively feel like I'm synthesizing things and I'm putting all the information that I've took in to work and actually like, creating something out of it. And so for me, it's just a very beautiful, fulfilling process to go through the sort of synthesis process, bringing in quotes from all the different things I've read and to just really, digest all the information. And for me, it's sort of like a practice of meaning making. Like this is like how I'm trying to make sense of and make meaning out of all the different things in the world is through the process of writing and podcasting. And so that's pretty much my biggest motivation for writing and doing the podcast. And then meaning or freedom rather. I became really interested in it after reading a book called Nordic Ideology by Hansi Freinacht. And so he talks about this idea of metamodernism or metamodern politics. And so he brought up the idea of freedom, and there was this really fascinating piece that he put out on freedom. And so it just really stuck with me. So I decided to write a piece on it and try to integrate some of the other stuff I've read on freedom as well. But basically the synopsis of it was that freedom is a feeling, that if you don't feel free, then you're not free. And so even if like someone says that you have freedom, if you don't feel free, then it doesn't matter. So he brings in a lot of the emotional components of freedom. So he basically says like you take the insight of like the interconnection of all things. Everything's interconnected. You can't have a piece of paper if you don't have the guy that drives the truck and cuts down the logger that cuts down the tree and the sun. Like, you kind of take that insight. And for me, that insight, I've been sitting with that a lot, however there's the web of interrelationships in like what is that, or like really like trying to sense into and make meaning out of sort of how everything is in this vast web of interrelationship. And so I've been sitting with the idea of like, what is culture, what is society, what are these things? And to me, it's like culture is like this web of interrelationships, and it's how I've been sitting with the ontological design inside that you've wrote a couple pieces on as well with, if culture is this vast web and we're deeply enmeshed in culture. And so culture has a fundamental impact on us just as much as we impact culture. And there's kind of like this reciprocal feedback loop of sorts. And so the topic of freedom for me was a contemplation of, how does that web interact my feeling of free, like interact with, with the notion of freedom, and basically kind of taking freedom out of this, like, I'm free if I can do what I want or when I want, versus I'm free if I don't feel like, basically saying that freedom is more than just the ability to do what I want when I want without someone like controlling me, but actually it can go into the inner domain. So like, what is the sort of inner components of freedom? Because I've noticed this in my life too. If I feel super alienated, if I feel like struck by an intense amount of shame, like it almost feels like I'm being controlled by those emotions, and I don't feel free, because it's like, the emotional component has such a large impact on my subjective experience that, if freedom is like a sort of a subjective experience, then also my inner state and how sort of culture and family and all these sort of psychological components influence, how trapped I feel, or something that's going to influence whether I feel free or not. And so it's kind of just for me, it's kind of trying to bring a synthesis of, the sort of political notions of freedom with other domains such as psychology, sociology, and, all sorts of different aspects, but especially psychology. So I'm really trying to integrate the sort of insights that psychology is bringing forth with sort of the insights of politics, and maybe we can find some connection between those, and how does politics influence psychology and vice versa.
Excellent. No, I appreciate all that. I think this is an incredibly important topic. So a few things. First off, what you were saying about writing as a processing, it makes me think at the end of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, where he talks about, he's gone through this poem and he has a lot of reference, a lot of allusions to Augustine, the Upanishads, all these different works. And he says, I saw these fragments against my ruin, London Bridge is falling down, Dante and then Shanti. The notion is that something that was increasingly defining modernity is this notion of you have all this culture, all this information, but you lose the ability to say structure it into anything meaningful. And so they become like fragments that kind of overwhelm and weigh you down, and you're trying to find a way to structure them. Obviously, Mr. Eliot found a way to do it in a poem, was a way that he would shore the fragments together. And of course, there's a sense in which religion in the past would say, give you a paradigm by which to determine information you should care about and information you should not care about. Because information actually does not tell you on its face if it's worth caring about or not. And Neil Postman is very good in watching TV news about the problem of how breaking news tells you that this is important and you should care about it, and it may have nothing to do with your life, but you feel kind of a moral responsibility to know about it, right? And so information has this way of pulling you apart, fragmenting you, and increasingly today, where there's more information. So actually practices by which you sort the information become more and more important. I think in the same way, we tend to think that consuming information is a neutral act. It's not, it's actually, we almost assume learning is better than not learning. Like it's better to gain information than not gain information. But actually, if you're gaining information and you don't have a way to put it together into a structure, I think it adds to depression. I think it adds to mentally being off. I think it adds to a giant weight, and it becomes a bad thing. So, and I think this will get into the topic of freedom. We don't tend to think about gaining possibility with a corresponding conditionality or responsibility to meet a certain condition to handle that new possibility. So for example, we go, oh, we have the internet, oh, we can learn more, great, and that's the end of the conversation. When actually you need to add this, like, well, now that you have that, if you're going to use it, it will be very important for you to develop processes by which you can organize that information so it doesn't feel like your head is full of a bunch of fragments. Because the notion of that line, shore fragments against ruin, a way to take that is the notion that you have to put the fragments together or you will be ruined. You will be ruined if you don't figure out a way to put it together. And I think you see that. And so for me, there is something about writing that has a unique ability to centralize and to put thoughts together, and also to help you figure out what books, what ideas should you really make a point to remember and carry with you, just by virtue of the fact, like the book you mentioned, you finished it, you couldn't help but write something about it, right? So it just struck you as being important. Well, not every book you read do you write something about, and there tends to be good reason for that. It's not the case that the book couldn't be the magic for someone else, but for you, there's a certain magic there. So you want to carry out an act that will help your brain remember the book as being important, so that you're able to tell difference between signal and noise, right? We'll talk about noise and signal. And for me, I wouldn't make a hard statement. It would seem quite difficult to be able to tell in one's own life the difference between noise and signal without some sort of practice of writing, some sort of practice of, say, communicating with people and talking through deeply. And it does have to move into that. I think it does have to move into a realm that is really focusing on subjects. Otherwise, it's that Heideggerian chit chat that doesn't help you know how to organize your being in the world in a manner that avoids nihilism. So in a way, one of the practices, just reading your pieces, where the different practices by which to deal with the meaning crisis, to find meaning and to feel free, I actually think writing is indeed one of the practices that can help one feel free, because it helps you gain control over your mind and to tell what in your head is a signal and what is a noise. And it is very difficult. So on the topic of freedom, it is very difficult to feel like you're free if you don't feel like you have direction, if you can't tell the difference between noise and signal. And in fact, a lot of the problem today is people are free in so much as everything is noise. So they're not oppressed by a signal. The problem is freedom from a direction is not very freeing now, is it? You don't feel very free because you don't know what to do. And so for me, it's interesting to think about, I like to talk about kind of directionism and the notion of that balance between freedom and direction, freedom and structure, givens and releases, the sociology language, so that you feel like you are free in a direction, that you are going somewhere, that you're moving in a certain direction. And I think practices like writing can contribute to that. And before passing it back to you, something I think to the point that you're making at, often we think about freedom as a legal category. We say, I have freedom because, it's not against the law to speak to you right now across Zoom. I have freedom because no one is, say, forcing me to go work in a mine somewhere or something like that. And so therefore we say we're free. Well, I think it's really important to make distinctions between legal freedom and what you could say personal freedom, individual freedom, because when you don't make those categories, you tend to think that if you have legal freedom, you also have individual freedom, if you will, or that you feel free. And those are not necessarily the same thing. It brings to mind something that Christopher Hitchens said on the freedom of speech debate back in like 1992 or something. He said, it's not enough to have the freedom of speech. You also have to feel like you can speak freely. If you live in a society where no one puts you in jail for saying certain things, but if you say something and then nobody talks to you anymore, you lose your job. Yeah, sure, you legally have the freedom of speech, but it's not going to really matter very much to you. In a very similar way, you could have legal freedom, but if you don't have the control of your mind, if you don't have your emotional clarity, if you're not in a community that enables your freedom, you're not going to feel very free. And so there's a sense in which, based on, on the article you wrote, the mistake we've made is to conflate bare minimum legal freedom with individual, personal, spiritual freedom, if you will. I'd have to think of a term. I was reading, I was like, I gotta come up with a term. So maybe I'll just say individual freedom. We'll just say that for here. Or you could say social freedom. I'll have to think on that, but individual freedom. And then the problem, of course, is, I think Robert George is correct on this when he says that law teaches. So law teaches us. Well, what ends up happening is freedom by the law teaches us that that's the only kind of freedom. So we get taught to think that's the only kind of freedom. So then we don't pay attention to our individual cultivation, our emotional cultivation, and how our mind works. And so then we don't have freedom because we are taught by the very legal freedom to think that there is no other element of freedom. And then we end up in some of the problems that you've been pointing to.
Yeah, so I think you were pointing to something really valuable here, which was something I've been contemplating as well, which is the notion of sort of cultural capital, spiritual capital, like all these other forms of capital, right? So something I've been contemplating is like, all right, how do you measure value? So you have like sort of money as like monetary value. Then you also have like cultural capital. So if someone has a lot of, say you go into a social group and everyone's like congregating around like one or two people, they have like a lot of like cultural capital or social capital, right? And so you can say like almost the freedom, and I think what this guy was pointing to, Hansi, as well, is like the freedom to acquire cultural capital is also a freedom, right? If you could have a bunch of money, but if everyone, like if you, or say the freedom of speech thing, like if you do have the freedom to say anything, but if you say something and then you feel alienated from the rest of the people, and then you just like that's not like it's not quite freedom going all the way, or it's not taking freedom to its fullest extent. Whereas freedom would be, the freedom of speech, for example, maybe it's we're creating an environment, a container where nothing is judged, or like we do our best to actually stop that from happening so that everyone has an equal level of sort of social capital or social freedom within the group. And so I've been really contemplating like, how do those interact? How do, we can really measure tangibly the sort of economic capital, but it's much harder to measure the social capital, the cultural capital, the spiritual capital. And so, we tend to, I feel like the freedom, when you were pointing to the sort of freedom by law versus freedom by other things, it's, to me, how that comes up, it's like, we give everyone an equal, like, economic freedom. You can go and you can make as much money as you want, but we don't give everyone the same amount of social freedom, spiritual freedom, all these other types of freedom. And another thing that was coming up a lot was something we spoke about on the last call, or that I've read in a lot of your pieces as well, which is, let me just like start from the beginning. You have sort of, so with like the rise of the internet age, with the rise of the sort of digital economy, we're very much in this sort of like postmodern digital age. Like postmodernism seems to be like a fundamental tenet of the sort of information age. And so because it's such driven by postmodernism, then we have so much information, but it's all sort of deconstructed, right? And so you talk about this, it feels like there's a lack of structure in the internet age. You have millions and millions of people expressing their opinions, creating stuff online, but where is the freedom? We have no structures of actually making meaning out of millions and millions of, like, we have channels and signal and or rather it feels like there's just so much noise, but like, where is the structure, right? And so it almost feels like freedom, right? I guess one more thing I wanted to bring up was, social media. So I've been contemplating like the use of like, how does social media interact with freedom as well? And it feels like it almost detracts from freedom. And so then the question would be like, what type of freedom is it like taking from us? And it's almost like this sort of attention freedom, right? It's actually like hijacking our brain so that we don't even have the freedom to choose where we put our attention if we're using these platforms, because it's like, it's so unconscious. Like, we don't even know why we're spending so much time on these platforms, but our brains, our limbic systems are so hijacked that we don't even have the freedom to choose where our attention goes anymore, unless we like completely get off the platform. And so then that would be like a sort of intellectual freedom. We don't have the intellectual freedom if we're putting all our time on social media, because we actually don't, they're pulling us in, and we don't actually have the time and space to let our intellect, contemplate other matters, right? And so the last one, what I wanted to bring up is, we talked about critical thinking on our last podcast a lot, and in this same notion sort of came up, like, we're in an age of deconstruction. Everyone's critical, everyone's mad, like there's so much polarization, outrage on the internet. And another way of framing that is, we're all expressing our opinions, but it's all sort of deconstructed, where everyone's like expressing what they're mad at and like breaking down all of the structures that have flaws right now. But there's definitely people doing it, but it feels like there's much less structure building happening, or there's much less actually meaning making and trying to build up new ways of understanding the world, rather than just breaking down all the old understandings of the world. And so I guess that could play into the notion of freedom as well. What is that freedom? What is the freedom to build, right? I think it also plays into like I was reading a piece this morning by Jordan Hall, and he was talking about scarcity and abundance within the sort of political sociological sense. It's like, if you're in a mindset of like, or if you're in a society that's driven by scarcity, you don't have the freedom to contemplate philosophers all day, because like the sort of cultural experience is that of like survival, and you need to work, you need to like grind and make money, otherwise you won't, like, it's the sort of rivalrous dynamics, right? So if you're in like a very strong cultural experience of rivalry, then where you don't, there's not much intellectual freedom, because it's just like all your energy is brought towards rivalrous dynamics. So it almost feels like the sort of game B conversation comes in as well. The more we kind of embody the experience of, if I win, you also win, then that's a sort of like intellectual freedom too, because it's like, oh, if I win, you win, therefore I can also like, you know, if I'm not in that mindset, it's hard to like justify spending time on things that aren't to get ahead or to play the sort of win at the sort of game theoretic dynamics happening. And so I'm curious what came up for you during all that. It was kind of sporadic.
No.
There's a lot there.
Well, the issue is, when you talk about freedom, the word can mean so many different things and has so many different expressions, but we talk about freedom as I talk about mono theories, like a theory of everything, versus polytheorems, which is like many theories to describe a single phenomenon. And the issue is that our culture talks about freedom like it's a single thing, when actually it's a diamond with very many sides, and there's many different expressions to it. Right. And also you have a notion that freedom is inherently good, which can confuse, because you're like, well, all these are freedoms, so aren't they all good? Well, it depends. If I'm free to say punch someone in the face because I'm not, say, installed with a chip that disables my muscles before they hit the person in the face, is that a good thing? You know, am I using my freedom well? You say, well, no, but would it be good if there were chips in my muscles that would keep me from throwing a punch? Well, no, because the government would then control you. You see, what ends up happening is that the topic of freedom, that we're trying, you know, in computer science, I might be incorrect about this, they'll talk about overfitting and underfitting, where you have a concept where you're trying to overfit it. You're trying to make it describe too much. Another way to put this is, if you make a map that tries to be a perfect replication of the territory, and it's so complex that you can't use it. But then at the same time, if you make a map that is too abstract and has too little to do with the territory, it's not useful. So the problem that ends up happening, it seems like freedom is prone to overfitting as a term. And yet, what other terms do we have, right, to describe like the freedom from government? You know, it's Isaiah or Berlin negative positive freedom, the difference between freedom from and freedom to. But you see, what's funny is very often freedom from and freedom to kind of come into conflict with one another, because you actually need social support in order to do the thing that you want to do. But that means you're not free from the social support. So then does the social support have some sort of claim on you, because it's there to enable you? Say, for example, you want to be free to play piano. Well, you need a society where people build pianos, unless you know how to build one yourself, a society of people who know how to tune a piano, someone who knows how to transport it to your house. There is a lot that goes into making a piano show up at your house, of which then means there has to be a social order that if you were free from, you couldn't be free to play piano. So then you have these certain conflicts of different kinds of freedom. And we end up just kind of talking about freedom as a very overfitting concept that then causes a lot of, well, what do we do with this? In what form is freedom good? In what ways is freedom bad? Something I was going to note before I forget, when we talk about, say, freedom of speech, for example, unfortunately, people hear that phrase now and it immediately goes to the political. But if you're sitting with your family and you want to talk about Heidegger, but you feel like every time you talk about Heidegger, they look at you funny because philosophy is impractical and why are you reading that instead of going to business school, then you don't have freedom of speech. You know, freedom of speech is not merely a political expression. It actually takes place in the family all the time. People all the time feel like they're not allowed to speak freely because they get judged, or people have not met the condition of understanding what they're talking about. So they feel kind of quote unquote trapped. They feel kind of stuck, right? That they're stuck in something and they have to perform, because if they break, they may want to talk about philosophy, but other people may not want to talk about it because they think it's a waste of time. So you feel like you're not able to do that. So there's a sense in which you don't have the freedom of speech. But here's an interesting thought. What if there's actually a good in being forced not to talk about philosophy whenever you want to, because there's something to be said about learning how to meet people at where they're at? Maybe there's something good at learning how to ask somebody about their job at the wholesale and taking a genuine interest in it. And you shouldn't just be sitting there the whole time thinking that these people are so stupid, I can't bring up philosophy. Well, maybe you can actually, you are free to interpret this situation as an opportunity of humility and also to genuinely learn about difference. You know, we talk a big game as a society about difference. Well, guess what? That would be an opportunity to really meet difference. You know, it's easy, say, to talk. We like to define, like if we like for philosophy, for example, we'll say, oh, I like diversity because I like talking to the analytical philosophers and the continental philosophers and the existential. I'm really diverse. Yeah, okay. You know, that's good. That's better than nothing. But there's a deeper kind of diversity, which takes an openness to people who say don't care about philosophy. Now, maybe they should care about philosophy. Maybe it goes the other way, right? They actually should be open to it. But, you know, if they're choosing not to, then the choice is, how are you going to approach the situation? Because there's also the freedom of how you choose to meet a situation and interpret a situation. And you might actually find that if you learn the skill of being able to genuinely appreciate people talking about their work at the wholesale or their day or how they can't wait to go plant the flowers, that might actually train you to be capable of seeing the world in new ways that you didn't think was possible, which then actually opens up doors to a greater freedom and a newer freedom. And then you might actually have a brand new philosophical idea you never thought of that involves flowers and grocery stores because you sat there and listened to the old guy in the diner on Tuesday morning that you would have never met if you would have simply focused on the fact that you don't feel free to talk about philosophy when you want to talk about it. So this is what becomes so interesting to me about the topic of freedom, is that there's some element of discernment about what good is most fitting for the situation, and thus that is what should be pursued. What's very interesting, I think it's difficult to talk about freedom outside a conception of what's good. Like what is the good and the beautiful and the true, because otherwise it goes all over the place, because all freedoms seem like they have an equal claim to be the freedom that is focused on, right? So how do you, in a situation, determine which of the possible freedoms that you should focus on and you should pursue? And I think then the question becomes, what is the good? Because of course, good can be used to oppress people. You say, well, X is good and everyone must conform to it, Foucaultian essentialism or whatever. It seems to be that there's a deep level of paying attention to what is good for you in the sense of, I need to be able to really listen to people. I need to be able to control my temper. I need to be able to see the beauty and the good and the truth in the people around me who want to just talk about sports, for example. You may not like sports, you may not care about sports, but they really like sports and they really care about sports. So maybe there's something you can learn by listening to those individuals. And you would see that opportunity. Now, at the same time, knowing that these individuals really like to talk about sports, you may want to be wise about how much you engage with that group all the time if there's something that you want to pursue, because you know that that's what's going to happen. That's not intentionally avoiding them. That's just being wise about the nature of diversity in time management. But if you are in the situation, you're thrown into it in a Heideggerian sense, then there's a question of how you are to respond to it. So for me, I guess, and then I'll pass it back to you, it's interesting to think about freedom as response, and response in a manner that is toward the good, which then would require a pretty profound sense of self-knowledge and self-discernment to determine, oh, wait a minute, that sounds like you have to, figure out meaning and stuff and match the meaning crisis and how those two issues really kind of flow together. Because if you don't have an ability to see meaning, well, then it's kind of hard to even know what it means when we talk about the good, right? There's no meaningful good. And so overcoming or having a sense of meaning and pursuing the meaning seems to be a necessary heuristic by which to determine how to balance which goods, how to trade off which goods, how to focus on which freedoms, I was saying goods, which freedoms, which in a given situation, that without that compass, it all kind of cancels out in different things. so, you know, I think it all to me goes together. And the last thing I'll say is there's this quote in Dallas Willard that I always liked, where he said something like, freedom is not, say, a kid jumping around, you know, getting all the candy and sugar that he wants. Freedom is the feeling where you've heard a performance of Beethoven that's so great that you can't keep your seat and that you jump up in applause. To be taken in by something that feels that it's greater than yourself and something more. And that notion of freedom, which seems to be tied to rising above, overcoming, you know, not being bound to the immediate, not being bound to facticity, all seems to be kind of linked together. But again, and then I'll pass it back to you, none of this, though, tends to even be a concept in our minds, because we've been taught by legal freedom to think of freedom only as a legal category. So these are not considerations that people tend to take into account. As a result, society just becomes a giant battlefield of conflicting freedoms, none of which can be organized as better than any other on their own, because all of them are equally a form of freedom. And that just means you have equally valid competing goods. Well, then that means the competition just has to come down to power and dominance. Because if you don't have a standard of the good to break the tie between all the freedoms, then you have to go to a different standard. And what other standard is there other than dominance and power? And that gets into the game theory of conversation stuff that we described last time, or that incentivizes critical theory as critical thinking as deconstruction. Exactly what you were saying. What else are you to do other than deconstruct other people's freedom so that there's only one freedom less? There can only be one, kind of Highlander sort of thing. That basically has to be what occurs if there is not an ability of people to, say, discern meaning and good in a situation to figure out what freedom they need to pursue in the situation.
Yeah, this really brings up for me the meaning crisis stuff, right? And I think you looped it full circle as well with this sort of, what is critical thinking? Is it breaking down other people's, constructing your own? Part of that is like, what does it look like to construct a new structure for meeting, for a new way of understanding what is good, what is meaningful, what is beautiful, all this stuff. And so, yeah, it feels to me like you're kind of centering around that, the true, the good, and the beautiful the whole time. Like if you don't have those, then how do you determine what is good and bad freedom? And
because, I mean, not to interrupt, because in some situations, freedom to should be emphasized. Other situations, freedom from should be emphasized. Some situations, the freedom of the community should come first. Other situations, the freedom of the individual should come first.
Right.
All of which has to be done in honor of maintaining the legal freedom and not violating that, and a moral freedom. Well, how in the world could you begin to organize all of those without some additional value set out beyond freedom, of which organizes the freedom? And that's where you end up in meaning good, beautiful, and truth.
Right. It's like, the more we talk about it, it's such a complex issue, because there are so many different facets of society, culture, politics, in which different notions of freedom could be valuable. And it really solidifies in me the sort of context dependent nature of freedom, right? In one context, one type of freedom might be more valuable. In another context, another type of freedom might be more valuable. And then it's like, well, then how do you determine, what those contexts are? And in every context, like, all right, what is meaningful in this situation, right? So what I'm thinking, like, I'm just trying to like think of examples on the spot, right? If we're having like this super philosophical, intellectual discussion, we're going to use a different marker for what's valuable to have freedom to talk about, right? So we're going to be like, yeah, the freedom to discuss any of our belief systems, any of this could be really valuable, right? Whereas if you're in a football game with your family, you're not going to be thinking about freedom to express beliefs as much as freedom to be open, or freedom from shame and guilt and being judged, or something like that, right? Like very sort of different domains. And so, yeah, it does feel like it comes back to the meaning crisis stuff a lot, because it's like, how do you judge? If you deconstruct everything, then like you're like, all right, well, everything. I think I'm trying to bring in the psychology as well, right? If you deconstruct everything, then how do you determine what is meaningful to talk about when? How do you judge? Like, how do you judge what context it is and what you measure it against? And Absolutely. Then then I'm really sitting with the sort of mini crisis depression sort of thing. Like
Absolutely.
if someone due to sort of societal influences feels really depressed, then like it almost like they that's like a lack of freedom, almost like a, you know, like having freedom to be inspired in the sort of Beethoven example, right? The freedom to have access to different subjective states of beauty and meaning is also a freedom, right? If I'm going throughout my day in the world, and I have some freedoms, I'm not in a concentration camp or anything, but I due to the nature of, you know, my life, what I'm kind of forced to do by just nature of my environment, how I grew up, I had to get this job in order to survive, otherwise my family, like there's like this very complex thing. And then it's like, yeah, and so maybe I have freedom to certain freedoms, but I actually don't have the freedom to pursue any deeper subjective states, or I don't have the freedom to overcome the depression, right? I'm kind of forced into this thing, and then it makes me depressed, but I don't know why I'm depressed. I don't have the freedom to pursue deeper psychological understanding or philosophical ways of making meaning, right? And so it's just like, yeah, it feels to me like there's so many components of this.
Well, the issue is that I think very often in these conversations, they interrelate exactly what you were saying in your piece. There's a radical interrelation of the individual and the community and the social in different things. The Indra jewel that you were mentioning, if I'm pronouncing that correct. Well, the funny thing is values are very similar. They all interconnect, like freedom, goodness, equality, justice. You know, who cares about freedom if there's no justice, because people are just using their freedom to create injustice? Who cares about freedom if there's inequality, because people are free in their class systems and they can't escape it? But who cares if there's no classes, if everyone is, say, kind of not allowed to freely pursue what they want to pursue, because it could create inequality, right? You know, who cares if you have justice if the way you create justice is by making everyone a prisoner at their home, right? You can't leave your home. Oh, there's plenty of justice because, you know, no one's doing anything to anyone else, but it's, you know, it's miserable, right? So the funny thing is we often talk about values. So I think today we're getting better generally. I'm not as good as we need to, but I think society is starting to get a little better at understanding the balance between the individual and the social and the communal, and there's an emphasis in different things. And that's a very good development, that we're getting a better sense, not a good sense, a better sense, but a better sense that these things interconnect in valuable ways. Because basically what we've done is either gone too far in the direction of community and the individual doesn't matter, or we've gone in the individual doesn't matter, all that matters is the social, the classic socialism, capitalism debate, and so on and so forth, when really you have to get into things more interesting, dare I say, like a communitarianism of Jonathan Rauch, and, you know, so things that are talking about there's no such thing as the individual that is not located in a network, but also the network's ability to sublimate and to rise to higher possibilities is also contingent upon what the individuals do in their own free time, in their own individual lives. You get a more complicated network. But problematically, I'm afraid that it doesn't seem to me that we are yet to understand that something similar applies to values, such as freedom and justice and things like that. It is not the case that freedom ever exists independent of a relation with other values. Like, as individuals never exist independent of a society, values never exist independent of all the other values. But we tend to, in discussion, talk about one value versus another. Like, we'll have a conference on justice, a conference on freedom, a conference of equality and different things. It's impossible because you can't even make sense of those values unless they're talked about in relation to the others. Oh, well, that's really hard all of a sudden. That's very, very difficult, because here's the value that it would thus require. You would ultimately, since we're talking about situation, it's very situational, not relative. That's been such a terrible word, but it's very situational. And the way that the breakdown of values needs to be is extremely concrete. But determining what it is would require discernment, and then judgment that is the correct breakdown, and then action on those judgments. One of the things that has gotten us in trouble is, in fact, we're afraid we actually don't like judgment or discernment, because judgment sounds judgmental. And who are you to decide that X is the breakdown of the values in the situation? So you have a culture that people don't want to say judge or say or decide what it is, because what is that? That's a kind of violation of freedom and possibility, right? So in the name of freedom and possibility, there's not a judgment, which is not the same as judgmental, but we're very kind of knee-jerk against that term. There's a resistance to judgment of the balance of values that need to be incorporated in us also judging how we are going to interpret a situation, because that threatens freedom and possibility. But you know what's funny enough, what ends up happening then is, sure, you get your possibility, but it becomes a weight to you. It becomes burdensome, like you're not showing the fragments. You know how we talked at the beginning, you have to shore the fragments with writing and different things, right? Judgment is how you direct freedom. If you do not direct freedom, one of the things causing the meaning crisis is precisely the overabundance of freedom, funny enough. You have no social guides. You don't have any like roots in a community. You're a neoliberal where you can go, like you were talking about with Colin. That was such a great talk on this balance between travel, but also rootedness, right? You know, when you don't have roots, you're free to move, but then you're not free to feel grounded, right? To feel like you have a foundation. Right. But then what do you have to do to get roots? You have to judge that you need to get roots. What do you have to do to figure out you need to travel? You need to judge that it's not good to always have roots, right? So there has to be the act of decision, decisiveness, the choice. Freedom is not very good. You know, a lot of times people talk about freedom and choice together, but actually don't tend to realize that their way of defending freedom actually disables choice in that freedom. So there's kind of, because they won't judge or they won't discern or they won't make a decision, because that's going to limit freedom, right? Well, funny enough, who cares about freedom if you never actually move it to the realm of deciding something to do? And you see, that's where you start directing freedom. Like you were talking about in your piece on these different practices, for example, where you were saying like people that say you want to reach a state where you're not pressured to do things at work that don't rhyme with your values. Well, you have to judge that your values are worth fighting for. Right? You have to make a stand. If you say you want to, it's important in order to feel free that you feel like you're good enough, right? Well, then you have to judge that you have a right to feel like you're good enough, right? There is actually a judgment there. That's a kind of like, it's like a dog fighting for its toy, right? You know, it has its toy and you're trying to take it and it's fighting and it won't give you back. There's actually something to be said about there has to be a kind of like hold on to it and not let it go. Like, I think that I have an intrinsic value. You cannot take that from me. I think that my, you know, I think that life is not about money, just about money. Money is not inherently bad, but it's not just about money. And you can't take that away from me because I have judged that as important and the system cannot take that away from me. But you see, that requires this, this kind of gripping, this kind of holding, this kind of like fight. What's interesting to me is that, you know, the word fight even sounds violent, but there's a kind of like a passion. You know, passion entails a kind of ferocity, a kind of fight, not a violent fight, but a sort of belief in something that you're going to stand for. And to me, it's interesting to think, like if that piano example, if you're going to actually practice to the point where you're a world-class pianist, there is going to have to be a certain level of, I believe in this and nobody can take this from me. And let's see what happens if they try. Like, let's see what happens if they come up and tell me that I'm wasting my time and see. It's like, I'm not going to yell at them. I'm not going to, you know, be mean to them, but I'm going to stick to what I have judged and decided is important. So it's, to me, one of the problems becomes is when freedom is separated from that value of commitment, I want to call it, you know, this kind of, this kind of commitment to it might be a better word than fight, but there is a kind of, you know, if you're committed to this, you fight for it, you defend it. There's a good in that. There is a good in fighting for something, as opposed to colonialist, imperialist fighting against, you know, you believe in this, so you fight for it, you defend it, you don't just abandon it. But what ends up happening, I think that's occurred, that is kind of like everyone seems today to be stuck, kind of caught between all these different kinds of freedoms, is because there is a sort of concern of, what if I choose the wrong thing? What if I fight for the wrong thing? What if I miss out because I decide to kind of grip onto this? But you see, if you don't do that, then it's basically inevitable that all the different kinds of freedoms cause an overwhelmed, it overwhelms you and it gets to you and it causes the meaning crisis. And then I'll pass it back to you. The other thing, if you find something meaningful, you only find it meaningful to the degree that you hold on to it, that you fight for it, that you like really grab onto it and commit to it. I call it the real choice. It would seem like in order to really have meaning, there has to be a real choice. But of course, a real choice, what's funny is if I choose to do X, I'm no longer free to do Y, Z, and A, B, C, or whatever. But I am now free to fully experience X. So you move when you make a real choice from the freedom of things you could do to the freedom of fully experiencing, to fully being. And that seems to me, I guess, as I've been talking, there seems to be a difference between the freedom to choose and the freedom to fully experience. The freedom to choose and the freedom to fully experience. And it would seem that you have to give up some degrees of freedom to choose to gain the freedom to fully experience. And if you never get the freedom to fully experience, so if you never move to that phase, now, of course, you don't want to just start off choosing something that you're going to stick to because you haven't had enough experience to know what is the thing that you should grip onto. But there seems to be a very necessary transition point where then you make a real choice and now you move into a space of fully experiencing, which if you don't, then you're going to always be caught in this vortex of different competing values, competing freedoms, and different things that I think leads to the depression, that leads to the meaning crisis, and then you don't feel free. This is the thing. If you never transition from freedom to choose to freedom to experience, well, then the freedom to choose quickly stops feeling like a freedom at all. Eventually, not at first, but it will eventually kind of rot. It will lose. It's got an expiration date. The freedom to choose seems to have a kind of expiration date that has to eventually move into a freedom to fully experience. But of course, that takes a risk, because what if you choose X to fully experience and Y would be better and whatever and different things. And you can always wonder that, but that's where then courage comes in, right? That's where bravery comes in. That's where belief comes in. And then those new values, those other values that have to be in play with the value of freedom comes into play as well.
Yeah, what's coming up a lot for me is the sort of developmental aspect of freedom, right? And so how this was landing for me was when you spoke of like the freedom to feel good enough, you have to actually feel that it's possible to go from a place of not feeling good enough to then develop into a place of good enough. And then same thing for like mastery as well. If you want the freedom to experience mastery of the violin, you have to think that there's a potential to develop that mastery, right?
Exactly.
And so a lot of times it feels like the sort of deconstruction kind of breaks that down and kind of takes the developmental component out of it. And it just like, well, all types of freedom are equal, but it feels like adding back in the developmental component is very important. And so what was coming up for this right now was sort of, let's say you just take the societal development, or let's just take like, all right, traditional, modern, postmodern, and beyond. That's like a sort of developmental path, right? And so we can say that many different people in society are grounded in different value memes a lot. So there's some people that are deep in sort of traditional values, deep in modern values, deep in postmodern, deep in postmodern. And the sort of freedom component that it feels like we're talking about is the freedom. So I think when we talk about postmodernism a lot of postmodernism, we talked about like the paradoxes of postmodernism, where if someone is like deconstructing everything and they're like, well, all freedoms are equal, but as long as you agree with me that all freedoms are equal, right? And it kind of pushes the modern traditional value structures aside and sort of demonizes them in a way. It almost feels like a higher version of freedom than that would be honoring the freedom to believe in any value structure, knowing that there's going to be some people who, given their environment, their family upbringing, whatever, they ended up landing in a worldview that's very modern, right? And so we're going to give them the freedom to practice that modern value meme. So the modern value meme maybe comes with the values, freedom to do whatever type of work that I want, freedom to, there's going to be certain we talk about all the different notions of freedom, right? So like the experience of believing in a very rational, logical, modern worldview is going to come like with it many specific types of freedom that people are going to value, right? And so you talk about we live in a very like postmodern deconstructive age, or like that's like where a lot of the sort of leading edge, or like that's like where a lot of the political talks go as well, you know, the left and the right, the left seems to be in this sort of deconstructive mindset, the right in this sort of modern traditional mindset, right? And it feels to me like letting any of those value structures fight for their version of freedom is like a sort of, you know, if we tell everyone that all freedom is equal and that we should just deconstruct it, and then you need to believe me that everything is equal and nothing is better than anything else, then it does bring in this meaning crisis component. Whereas if I say, if you're believe in a sort of traditional value structure and you believe in the family value structure, you want hierarchy, you want these like very traditional values, like then go for that. Like it's almost like the freedom to find meaning in any of the value structures, right? So if you believe in a postmodern sort of meaning structure, like go all and like fight for that. If you believe in a sort of modern value structure, like fight for that. If you believe in a pre-modern, fight for that. Or find meaning, you're like able to choose that value structure, right? And so for me, it comes to like, all right, if someone's like on the edge too, right? If someone's in the modern value structure, but they're starting to see the value of like sort of postmodern value structures, then they can have the freedom to switch value structures, and then to go from a postmodern valuing, you know, freedom of work and like doing whatever type of work they want, to then freedom of the postmodern seems to be more like freedom of letting anyone voice their opinions in a group or something like that. Then like we should have, you know, different people, allowing different people to believe in different value structures. And
well, not to interrupt, but what you're getting at is very good. So, you know, for example, deconstruction kind of went, all right, so there's no ground to say individual values like freedom. Ultimately, you can't ground them in anything objective or anything like that. The problem is that, yeah, that analysis is correct. But the issue is that values were never singular. That's kind of the mistake of deconstruction. Is, yeah, sure, if you focus in one at a time at each individual value, you will find it does not have a ground. Sure, but they never operated as their own ground. They always operated in a concert with one another. They were held up from the side, per se. But of course, deconstruction can also come along and kind of suggest that judgment and decision and structure can be bad because they limit the individual. And those are the necessary components in order to figure out how those values go together in a given situation and what should be traded off and what shouldn't be traded off. So you remove, so if you do two things, one, you analyze each value on its own. And then second, you moralize not making judgment because judgment is quote unquote judgmental. And who are you to act like, say, Christianity or Islam or atheism is the truth? You don't know what the truth is. Who are you to act as if it was, right? You know, there's kind of like this postmodernism, if we use that as a catch, you know, as a general threat, there can be a kind of humility. It seems like it's almost humble and like moral to not act as if there is a, you know, that belief system is the way, or to act like you can't become the next great music composer. There's kind of like a humility that seems to be embedded in that. But actually that's not a good humility because it's a disabling humility. The right humility is, say, you commit to being a great musician and not believe that you're better than other people because you're a great musician. That's a good kind of humility, but a humility that's disabling is very bad. But so once you understand that all values always exist in concert with all other values, and then you also accept the necessity to make a choice and to choose one that you can fully experience, what you need in society is a world where everyone is genuinely living out their ultimate concerns, as Paul Tillich will talk about. They're genuinely being, their courage to be what they believe is the truth and are a shining example. Like both Islam and Judaism will emphasize this. You'll see in the Torah, for example, where it will describe that God is making a people that are, in a sense, beautiful, that will attract people in. And you'll also hear in Islamic evangelism the notion that if you just genuinely follow Allah and you're really living out, then people will see that and go, oh, wow, there must be something really to that. And notice both of those conceptions is not a let us force everyone to think like us. Let us instead have a kind of kind kind of competition in a sense where you say, we're going to genuinely live the way that we think is best. And the example that will show, almost like everyone's walking around like walking paintings or something like that, will then have an attractive element, because there's always this tension in religions between, spreading the faith, but also respecting difference and different things. How do you find that balance? That is an incredibly hard problem. The way postmodernism and deconstruction, which again, I have to give Derrida credit. I don't conflate Derrida with deconstruction. I think he was a very good thinker, but deconstruction in general is different. In the same way, there's a difference between Plato and Platonists and so on. Anyway, the way that deconstruction solved this problem was basically by just kind of undermining all of it. But that doesn't really solve the problem. That just gives you a new problem of people not feeling like they have a ground, when really what you need is a notion of everyone having a commitment to what they believe, to their truth, to to have the courage to be the way that they think they ought to be, and to shine with that, and to exhibit that ultimate concern. And then people who are religious, who feel like they need to share their faith and help grow the faith, well, they're doing that, but they're doing it in a manner that is not forceful. Instead, what they're doing is it's kind of an evangelism via beauty, right? It's a kind of evangelism via beauty, because if it's truly beautiful, it will attract people, because beauty is inherently evangelical in that sense. It attracts people, right? I mean evangelical, not in the denomination. Well, the same thing goes if you're a true believer in say Democrat liberalism, and you truly believe in the socialist values. Well, then commit to that and have the courage to be those values, and to show that how your household actually and your community functions better than say an individualistic community where people are all in it for themselves or something like that, right? Now, of course, it gets complex, because then you have elections and certain regimes and so on and so forth, and now we get into belonging again in the subject of all that. But generally speaking, the first step, I do think, is a realization of the living out of particular values. That's the way to go. But in order to do that, people have to judge and commit, and to really do those things, which we've kind of been trained basically by postmodernism, because we're afraid of missing out. Basically, there's a kind of fear behind it, that we don't do that. But of course, like in 1 James, we'll say the one who fears is not made perfect in love, that fearlessness and love go together very much. And really, it does take courage to go all in and to decide, this is what I'm going to live, to move from the freedom to choose to the freedom to fully experience with a commitment. That does take a courage. But actually, I don't think it's by chance. The world today doesn't feel like it has a lot of love in it. It feels like it has a lot of fight and a lot of strife and a lot of tribalism. Now, I know the news can make it seem worse than maybe it actually is. But I do think, generally speaking, well, I mean, there's obviously Ukraine. There are events that are occurring that feels quite violent. I actually think that the lack of courage contributes to a lack of love. Funny, and it's kind of funny, because we tend to associate fighting with courage, right? Like, oh, you're fighting for your nation, and there's a bravery in that sort of conflict. Well, actually, the kind of courage that we need is the courage to be, that I'm describing, which is the movement from a freedom to choose to the freedom to express, in a sense. And then I'll pass it back to you. The funny thing is that you can't escape all the value. How I was saying that all values are linked with all other values. The funny thing is, if you don't focus on the whole, all the values are still going to pop out in different areas of your life. They're just going to pop out pathologically, violently, and problematically. So, for example, a world that doesn't prioritize the courage to be in a real choice for the fullness of expression is still going to have the virtue of courage appear. It's just going to appear in the realm of armies fighting one another, or it's going to appear in the courage to say protest the election results. It will appear in the courage to say disagree with people who, to stand up in a meeting and tell people who have different political views from you that they're stupid. All of those can be framed as courageous acts, right? And of course, the people tend to frame them as courageous acts to rationalize doing them. So that's really kind of the issue. Like, when you don't own the fact that all values are always connected with all other values, they still all show up. They just tend to show up in manners that rationalize pathologies, violence, and problems. So it's really, really important to see that they're always in operation, and therefore to own the practicing of all of them in different areas, and to ask yourself, okay, I prioritize freedom, but have I determined for myself what I think is the good that I should commit to and be courageous to stand for? Have you taken that step? If you haven't taken that step, you need to take that step, because otherwise commitment may come up in the form of you become committed to defending your empty freedom, and anyone who tells you to make a choice, you fight them off, right? So you're committed to defending this possibility space, but it's an empty space because it never manifests into anything. So the commitment and courage still shows up, but it then comes in service of preserving the empty freedom, as opposed to being in service of realizing the freedom into something that you feel like is full being, and that's worth having courage to be.
The sort of dilemma or the tension that's popping up for me is, I'm going to try to express it here in a couple examples. So the one would be like, how do we support all the different value structures, right? So not just the postmodern value structure, but because all the values are interlinked. Say we want to support the modern, the pre-modern, the postmodern. We want to support the religious values, the capitalistic values, the sort of right values, the left values. We want to, there's value in all of them, so we want to support all of them. But then, like, at some point, it feels like, you know, take the US on like a national level, there's certain sort of values that are being implanted top down into society. Like there's certain, like, at some point you have to judge, like, all right, there's certain like national events happening, and they're kind of imparting certain values onto the entire population, right? It feels like, especially the sort of diversity, equity, inclusion is one that's kind of on a national level, like seen as important, right? And then as society develops, the sort of values of society itself kind of permeate, and like, how do you decide what those values are? So then the sort of tension that I'm sitting with is, how do you support sort of pre-modern, modern, like some of the values that are kind of shunned by the leading edge? You know, there's certain, like, if society develops certain values that are like older values, the family values, the hierarchical values, all that stuff are kind of demonized in a certain way. So how do you actually support them while realizing that, like, the entire functioning of that system could be flawed, right? So like, the thing that I'm thinking is, like, all right, say like religion. So you take Judaism, Christianity, Islam, right? There's some serious value in the like there's certain value structures that we need to include, right? And so how do we support these? I'm thinking of the sort of, you know, the postmodern value of like inclusion. We need to include everybody, right? And so we need to include everybody, including all the religious people in the religious value structures, right? And then it's like, all right, we need to include, so say you have like the Islamic sort of ethnicity, right? And so like they come in, we're like, we need to like include this whole ethnic group, like that's a core value we hold. But then you like look at the sort of practices of a various religion and say, like, the way that they treat women is this way, or like sort of Christianity, like let's say someone is like completely against homosexuality, right? And then it's like we want to support the Christian value system, but then it also goes against like a core fundamental premise of like inclusion of all types of sexuality, all types of ethnicities, all this stuff, right? So it's like there's like sort of this tension of like, it's not that we want to completely like demonize all of the Christian value system or all of the Islamic value system or all of the modern, like, so let's take modernism, right? So like there's some serious value of having individual freedom, being able to create your own business, you know, to you know, pick yourself up by your bootstraps, to like there's certain value to the sort of individual freedom value system. But then also it could have externalities where it's destroying the environment and all this stuff. So how do you like support the fundamental value system while also realizing that some of the expression of that value system is causing harm? And it's like this very complex process, but it's like there's value and it also causes externalities, or there's value and it also supports things that a lot of times the values are in direct tension with each other. So it's like, it feels like the sort of conversation of dialectics could be very important here when values such as freedom, especially freedom, because that's what we've been talking about the most, when does freedom come in direct sort of dialectical tension with other values, and such as inclusion. Like if someone has the freedom to practice anything that they want, but then if they practice their religion and it excludes all of these people and they demonize all these other people, is it true freedom? Is it true inclusion? How are these in tension with each other? So I guess that's what I'm sitting with as you're bringing all this up, is sort of
friend,
all that stuff.
Well, this is why belonging again has been going on forever, because it all leads into one another. And that's exactly right. I really appreciate in your piece when you made the point to say that we can't say that all negative emotions are bad, because, for example, the feeling of fear could save your life because you're afraid of that snake, so you don't touch it and you don't get, poisoned to death or something like that. But then there's something bad about, say, the socially constructed negative feelings that are made to hold you down. Right there on that point that you made in your piece, that right there gets into why we have to think so much. And actually why, say, Heidegger, when he talks about chit chat and small talk, he really talks about them as if they are massive problems, which is kind of funny. You're like, come on, Heidegger, man, what's the issue? I mean, people can talk about the weather. What's going on? Well, what he wants to I always took it, and I'm no expert on Heidegger, is he's like, hey, we don't have time because we have to go through every single topic and issue. Because basically when you're talking about Christianity, for example, or Judaism or different things, basically what you'd have to do is go into every single individual religion one by one, see a way to work and interpret the internal consistency of the text where you do not make it violate any of its orthodox positions, but can also increase inclusion, which is a very massive exegesis work that you'd have to engage in. And if you go through and find out you cannot do that, well, then you run the risk of, okay, then does that mean in order to be a true Christian, you have to be against X, Y, and Z because there's no way to find an interpretation of the Bible that would increase inclusion without violating orthodoxy? Well, maybe then we have to rethink the nature of how we formulate orthodoxy. How did orthodoxy come about? And then you get into the structure of how the books of the Bible was put together. And you say, well, maybe that's not how we should validate it. And then you get the big debate between Protestants and Catholics between if only the Bible has authority or if the Bible and the tradition and the clergy, the magisterial has authority. You have to go one by one, topic by topic. And also what you were saying, you'd have to go by law, by topic, for example, right? This is what there is no, you have to, the reason why philosophy does, or philosophical or deep thinking does seem to not, it does not seem to be optional, is precisely because you have to go into the specific details of each topic. And the specific details, like when you talk, like I use the phrase internal consistency of the Bible. Well, that means like literally the entire gambit of ideas and values and notions of which compose Christianity that have to all work together like a machine, a well-oiled machine, where all the gears have to turn so the whole thing goes together, right? And if you say, well, we need to remove that part where it says women can't, be the heads of churches. All right, see, if you remember that board game Operation, where you had to reach in and not hit the side so it makes the buzz noise and the whole thing brews up. So how do you reach in there, pull out that gear, and not cause the whole thing to screw up and replace it with a different gear, right? That's basically what you're talking about doing. Like to remove the bad and to keep the good is this very delicate operation of figuring out how to remove the bad while respecting everything around it, and then putting in something new that does not contradict with something that is in another place in the idea framework of the belief system. Well, that is a very, very complex undertaking. And it is not the case that simply saying that Christianity ought to let women run churches. Well, that's not enough. Even if that's true, you still have to do the activity of the delicate operation to justify that position, right? And you see the problem that ends up happening, it's kind of like Bonhoeffer talked about the difference. I always love this. I use this all the time. The difference between costly grace and cheap grace. So the notion of kind of costly grace is where, you believe that God forgives you of your sins, but you actually have to try not to sin anymore. It actually costs you something. Whereas cheap grace is where you're like, well, I can sin all I want because God will forgive me no matter what, right? So you just do what you want and you don't change. So that's cheap grace versus costly grace. Very often, what modernism will try to do is it will try to cheaply change people's belief systems without doing the work of actually thinking them through. And what cheap what we could call cheap reinterpretation versus costly reinterpretation. If I were to use those phrases, the word interpretation comes with a lot of baggage, so I would have to think about that. But for here, it will serve our purposes. A lot of modernism wants the fruits of reinterpretation to increase inclusion, to increase invitation, and so on and so forth, without doing the work to earn that reinterpretation. And you know what? It turns out that people who believe in those things really deeply, who really believe in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and so on and so forth, it turns out that when you try to cheaply reinterpret their works, they don't like it very much. And they tend to react very poorly, or they tend to react very strongly and turn to totalitarianism, which then increases the very lack of inclusion. So the issue that you're bringing up is the need to have the costly reinterpretation, or the real work of going into how people think, what people believe, which requires a lot of reading, which requires a lot of listening, which requires a lot of discussions and conversations. But that's what it takes. Another way to put this is we haven't been doing the work of postmodernism. We've just been entertaining the ideas of postmodernism. We've been entertaining the goals of postmodernism and just saying, well, let's declare them and they'll be thus. Let's declare that people need to be more inclusive and then they'll be more inclusive. No, they tend to get really upset and turn to totalitarianism when you force diversity on them. You could talk about the difference between cheap diversity and costly diversity. Costly diversity is where you really explore the depths of diversity and meet people on the grounds of their difference, like the person who likes sports while you like philosophy. Costly diversity is sitting there listening to the person really talk about sports when you don't care about it. Whereas cheap diversity is, say, the person says they like sports, you like philosophy, and you just kind of take a picture together, and then people can see that you like blue collar people or whatever, but then you never talk to them. You never actually engage with them or anything like that. And so you get, so the issue is that we have not been doing costly postmodernism, if you will. We've been doing cheap postmodernism, which then turns into, it just turns into politics today, unfortunately, which is a reaction to people feeling offended. Because then this is what happens when you treat people's difference as cheap, then it feels like a personal attack. They get offended. They're like, no, this is a deep belief. You can't just come in and tell me that I ought to let women, run churches, because my great-grandfather and my grandfather and my father, we all held these beliefs and we went to church every Sunday for, 100, generations of generations. And we believed this and we were taught this. And we believed it even though people called us sexist for believing it, but we're staying true to the Bible. They've really kind of embedded and invested in that premise. So you have to figure, so if you're going to come in and say that premise is incorrect, that's the game of operation. You have to go in and remove that premise that is grounded by years and years of emotional connection and put something new in its place. So I think N.T. Wright is a good example of someone who, say, goes in there and he does the costly work of saying, this is not the correct premise for how to run the church in Christianity. You need to change it, but in a manner that maintains the internal consistency of the entire system. So there are people doing that work, but I don't think we even appreciate as a culture that you need to do that work. Right. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I would say as step one is a movement from cheap postmodernism to costly postmodernism, or cheap reinterpretation to costly reinterpretation. That would be the social level. Now, the second question that you were asking is the political level. Like, what do you do when you have, say, government where someone goes in office and they have a certain premise that they can force upon everyone, whether it be that everyone needs to be inclusive or everyone needs to be, again, all welfare programs are enabling laziness and they're bad, whatever the premise is. So what do you do when you live in a political environment? Well, that would get us into the nature of how big do you want your state to be? How involved do you want your state to be? How much do you, very particular questions of what you want them to do and what you don't want them to do. If it would be better to have small government, but if you have small government, then people may, if they're doing something immoral, you're not going to have the centralized power to stop that, right? So that could be an example of the American Civil War or something, because you had articles of Confederacy that were not centralized enough, and then you had the Constitution that was more centralized, but even that was arguably not centralized enough. Now that would get us into going through the entire history of the Civil War and different things. But this is a very, but then of course the argument would be that now you may have a centralization that follows more. I mean, arguably Lincoln in his speeches after the Civil War was talking a lot of Rousseau, general spirit, general will. The Union preceded the states. The Union was before the states. You know, it's interesting in America, it went from the United States are, and then after the Civil War was the United States is. It was an interesting in the language, it went from are to is, which right there shows you a philosophical shift in the nature of the nation state. Now, is that a good thing? Well, obviously it comes with goods, but it also can come with bads, just like you're saying. It's all a mixture of these things. Well, and then I'll pass it back on to you because I think that actually, though, speaks to the necessity of really grabbing onto something and holding it. And really, because if the nation state is saying X and you've chosen Y, well, then you need to stand for that and you need to believe in that. Now, you also at the same time, though, well, and you need to because otherwise the nation state or the news media or whoever is going to come and force that out of you. And that would, the corporations will force that out of you. And that's delusion and capture. At the same time, though, if you're really going to commit to something, then that also comes with the responsibility of self-skepticism, of humility, of genuine love of the other, of genuine respect of diversity, so that the thing that you're gripping onto does not become a justification of force over the other or an alienation of the other. So that's an example where, again, the value of, say, really committing to something has to be held in concert with all the other values that maintains that genuine respect for the inherent dignity of the other person. Where you say, well, I really believe that Islam is the way to live, and I'm going to pray X number of times a day. I'm going to really hold to this. And my neighbor might be a Hindu, they might be a Christian, they might be an atheist and not believe it, but I'm going to respect that. But I'm also going to do my best to shine with an example of my beliefs in such a way that perhaps will attract them to considering an alternative, all while they themselves commit to what they believe and genuinely live it out, and maybe it will attract me to an alternative or different things. And to me, and then I'll pass it back to you, that kind of is what I think, say, someone like a James Hunter is talking about with substantive democracy, where there's real difference that figures out a way to get along. I think the other subject that you get into is indeed what Jonathan Rauch talks about in the context of Karl Popper, on how you decide the difference between what's called beliefs and knowledge, and what are things that individuals should be allowed to believe in their private homes that is not taught as knowledge for everyone to believe, and what is the system of testing ideas, and he'll get into the scientific method, which is different than the technocratic state, but then you have to draw those distinctions. So there are a number of topics, but the book Kindly Inquisitors, I think, does a very good job on that. Mr. Rauch will talk about on that.
Yeah, a lot of what's coming up for me is this sort of, we're dealing with differences, so different belief systems, different value systems, like, right, different, if someone loves sports and you like philosophy, different, interests. And so what's coming up for me is like, so much of today, it feels like there is just blanket polarization,
yes,
blanket just dissonance between different groups of people without the work being done. So I really enjoyed your take on the sort of weak criticism versus strong criticism, or the sort of like actually going in and understanding the mechanics of someone's worldview, so that you can then only then kind of offer maybe an alternative, but showing them that you've done the work to understand what they believe, rather than just saying you need to be inclusive. Like, if you don't allow women to be in your church, well,
in a way to put it, you will not convince people of alternatives that you don't show respect. And respect is shown in the work of going and seeing the whole and looking for alternatives in different things. I mean, Judaism has a long history of that, the debates on what the Torah said between the different rabbis. That is, I think, a good mental model to think about how to earn difference, per se, or earn alternatives. And you go through the whole work.
100%. And so I what keeps coming up is the question for me of like, what does that look like? Going about your day, people with very diverse range of beliefs and perspectives on the world. What does it look like to actually take an attitude of like trying to actually because then there's the time management thing, right? You don't have enough time to go into every single one's worldview and understand the mechanics of their worldview enough for them to feel heard and respected, right? So you have to be like, then there's this sort of judging component. You have to judge which worldviews, maybe you live in the Midwest, like where I live, and the vast majority of people believe in either like a sort of modern scientific or a sort of religious traditional. So maybe like for me, if I was raised in a sort of modern scientific, even postmodern deconstructive worldview a bit, maybe I feel like, all right, a lot of the people around me the vast majority of people around me that I don't understand are in this very religious Christian mindset. So then my work is to like really go into that, where if someone lives somewhere else,
Exactly.
the vast majority of people around them are in a sort of Judaic sort of worldview, and so for them that might be the best one. So like I'm trying to kind of thinking like, all right, how do I judge what worldview do I want to fully understand the logical coherent system of, and what is worth my time to diving into, and then also how do I do that? So then I'm going up to people and who have different worldviews, and how do I like really dive into their worldviews? And it feels like not everyone's open to that, right? A lot of people are not open to that. So then it almost feels like, for me, like I've noticed, I do have a strong desire to understand the Christian worldview because it's all around me. I've always grown up and like not understood it because I didn't really go to church growing up. I didn't really like do any of this stuff. I was just kind of raised on like the sort of atheist scientific worldview as being true. And so recently, like my grandpa is like super fundamentalist evangelical Christian. And so I'm like, and he's like super open to it. So I'm like, I think this is the perfect example. I reached out to him and I'm like, hey, I would love to like sit down, like talk about your worldview. He's like, oh, awesome. I would love to tell you about Christianity. And just like, it almost feels like the inquisitive mindset feels very valuable here. Like even from the gates, just starting like, hey, I would love to get to understand your worldview better. Like, just like that, that's a very warm way to approach this. It feels like everyone would be like, yeah, I would love to share with you about my worldview, as long as there's no sense of like an ulterior motive, like, oh, in order to then convince you of something else. It's like, no, like take that out of it. Just like, I just want to understand, someone else's worldview.
Oh, absolutely. Well, there's it can't be overlooked how much the role of the state in politics is always dangerous, because that creates a kind of feeling of desperateness, imperative of, oh, if we don't win the election, we're in trouble. Our beliefs will be attacked. Mm-hmm. We have not realized that politics always comes with that kind of danger in the involvement of the state, because we've kind of expanded it for good reason, for just reason, in fact, in order to expand access. It would get into the kind of big part of belonging again, which gets to what I want to call the conflict of society. So, which is the social version of the conflict of mind. And the conflict of mind, which is the first book in the Truism of the Rational, is about how epistemic responsibility comes in conflict with epistemic possibility, which a great example is exactly what you were just saying. It is literally not possible for you to fully explore the internal consistency of every possible worldview. And yet it's kind of epistemically irresponsible not for you to do that and to determine a judgment. And yet you have no choice. You have no choice but to deal with that. And so how do you condition yourself to live with that reality, to humble yourself before that reality, and yet nevertheless make a choice? And because if you don't make that choice, then the meaning crisis will continue to destroy you, because you have to move from freedom to freedom to fully express kind of thing, freedom to choose to freedom to fully express. But that means you have to make a kind of Kierkegaardian leap of faith, which then that ultimately cannot be rational, precisely because you have not yet investigated every possible worldview, and yet you have to do it. It's what I call a non-rational decision between rational and irrational. It's necessary because of the very nature of finitude. Well, so that's the conflict of mind, which is the individual version. The conflict of society is where social responsibility comes in conflict with social possibility. And what I mean by that is it seems as if it's socially responsible, for example, the society to expand everyone healthcare, or to expand everyone equal access to education and different things, right? But the issue is, how do you necessarily get a hospital in every possible location so everyone is in a network? How do you make sure that there's always enough doctors for everyone? system? And how do you make sure the economy is always of a certain level to where universal non-contingent healthcare is always the case? Well, it's actually not socially possible to have it be non-contingent, because you, one, have to have an economy that can support that, one, have enough doctors to make that a reality, and so on and so forth. And also, we know that civilizations, say 300 years ago, did not have it. So, you know, you can't have a non-contingent universal access to healthcare that is not also supported by finite conditions that have to be realized. But it darn well feels like it is socially responsible to create a world where that access is there non-contingently, but it's ultimately at the mercy of the social possibilities of the economy and how many doctors you have and so on and so forth. And yet you feel like you need to strive toward it, right? You feel like you need to strive toward it. Well, that right there, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't strive for universal healthcare, but it's always going to be operating within the horizon of what is actually possible by that society. If, for example, universal healthcare was an absolute value of a society, but there was literally no one who was a doctor, like there was literally no doctors, then that value would be a source of torture, right? Because you would be like, we're failing to live up to this value that is a non-contingent moral good, and we have no doctors. So it would become a source of neurosis, a source of psychological torment, right? That's the point I'm getting at. Not that the value itself is wrong, but that all values necessarily feel as if they should be non-contingent, that they should be applied non-contingently and go for everyone, right? Mm-hmm. But you're always caught between the social reality of needing enough doctors to make that a reality, or needing enough of a infrastructure to make that a reality. And we have to learn to live with that tension between the experience of values as necessarily being infinite, meaning that they should apply regardless the finite situation, and the fact that we are in a finite situation. And so that's a kind of inherent tension that you cannot escape simply by being finite. You understand what I'm saying? Values carry themselves as infinite, and yet we are finite, and yet we require values. Because if you didn't have values, society would not be possible. Arguably, society exists because there are values. There are values that are worth exercising and trying to pursue, right? If there's no such thing as justice, there's no values, well, there's no society, or there's certainly not a society that anyone wants to live in. So you require values that necessarily are experienced as infinite while you are finite. So right there is an inherent failure. You see what I'm saying? There's an inherent failure in every society. In the same way that there is an inherent failure in every individual to make epistemic or intellectual possibility match up with intellectual responsibility. There is always a failure of making social possibility match up with social responsibility. You see what I'm saying? We have to learn to live with that failure. And you see, a lot of the meaning crisis is a result of us not having the tools to live with that failure, and in fact get caught in that failure, and in fact believe that failure is evidence that the current political system is bad. So then you say, well, if our guy got in, he would fix everything. And so we get our guy in, and it must be those crazy conservatives, those crazy liberals that we got, those traditionalists, those postmodern, we get rid of them, then it will be good. Well, we get rid of them, and guess what? We're still finite, and our values are still infinite, so the disconnect is still there. And now we have less plausible deniability of why we can't fix that, and we become more existentially overwhelmed and neurotic and pathological, and everything begins to break down. And so really not taking into account that there is an inherent kind of failure, as I'm describing, in the human condition and in the social condition is very consequential. And the reason it is very important to accept this inescapable failure is because it transforms what your metric is to succeed and to be free, and what it means to be free, and how you should find freedom. And I think you find freedom, for example, in doing the very best you can, given the cards that you're dealt, which would include the break between the finite and the infinite as so described, grabbing onto something and really believing in it in a manner that respects other people, knowing at the end of the day, you're going to fall short, but you're going to give it a really beautiful performance, dang it. You're going to really do your absolute best to live with that tension that will inevitably come up short, but you're not going to quit. I think a lot of freedom actually comes from the refusal to quit. from a commitment to where you're going to put up to seek to fight to yield and not to yield, as kind of Tennyson talks about with Ulysses, to really know that you're going to do that musical performance of your life as best as you can, even though you know it may not be as good as Beethoven, it may not be as good as Mozart, but gosh darn it, you're going to try and you're going to do your best. I think that feeling of freedom really does come very much from going all in and doing one's best in something and to really believe in it. I think I was always taken, I've made examples of sports as if they're negative, so I'll make an example of it positive. I wrestled and did cross country for years. So I was always taken when Vince Lombardi, and he once said kind of in a speech, he said something along the lines of, there is nothing like the feeling of exhausted on the field, hardly able to stand, with the clock having ticked down, and you fall to your knees victorious. That feeling of really rising to the occasion and not giving up. And what's interesting is by victorious, he doesn't make it clear if he means they won the game. It is very possible by victorious, what he means is that they gave it all they could. They were all in and they did not give up. And that feeling of doing that and overcoming the temptation not to go all in and to really commit to something, I think that is the feeling of sort of the freedom that we seek. I do think, for me, like when we talk about what does it mean to be free, I think regret in some respects is the opposite of freedom, because it's too, like we've talked a lot about how you actually need some limitation to know how to even use your freedom, right? So it doesn't seem to be that limitation is the opposite of freedom, because limitation is what makes possible freedom, right? Like, you know, if you had a blank canvas, you wouldn't know what to do, right? There has to be something on the canvas to know what to do. But the moment you say paint a ball, or you paint something, you're now limited in what you can do, right? But you gain the freedom. Let me make a different example. If someone gives you a ball, you're now limited from not having a ball, but now that you've gained it, there's a freedom that you can do. So freedom and limitation always go together in very complicated and interesting ways, in the same way that all values go together. It would seem that's why it's hard to say that the opposite of freedom is limitation. It seems more to be the case that something like fear is the opposite from freedom, because you're afraid to do something because what will people think, or what if you mess up? Which then for me, a life of fear is a life that tends to end up in regret. So regret tends to be the outcome of fear. And a free life is one that does not have regret, which to me can also be associated is that you did not live your life at the mercy of necessity. And what I mean by that is, sure, you have to make money, you know, you have to pay for things, but was your entire life orbited around that necessity? And did that necessity determine everything you needed to do? Sure, you have to, there are many necessities. You have to take care of your health, for example. If you don't have health, it's hard to get through the day, and so on and so forth. But were you obsessed about your health to the point that all you ever did was exercise and you never hung out with other people, right? Because the necessity of health became the only thing that drove your life. I think overcoming regret, not having a life of regret, which would be a life of freedom, requires being able to look at your life, and even including right now, but especially at the end of it, and genuinely be able to say that I was not living simply according to necessity. I figured out how to take care of necessities in a manner, because I use wisdom and discernment and judgment to deal with the fact that I needed money, but not in a manner where I overfit the need to get money to where I did nothing else. I use my wisdom, discernment, and judgment to figure out how I maintain my health, but not in a manner where I became health obsessed. I use my judgment, wisdom, and discernment to figure out how to be in relationships, because I need relationships to fully function, but not in a manner where I became dependent on affirmation from other people to function. I use my judgment, discernment, and wisdom to figure out who I was as an individual so I could make choices for myself, because I am an individual. That is a necessity I have to respond to, but not in a manner that made me arrogant, egotistical, and feel like I was better than other people. I was not driven by necessity into overfitting or missing out or not figuring out the right balance. And I think if you can get to the end of one's life, or be in one's life, even right now, like Lombardi talking about that player on the field, and say that your life is not driven by necessity and you don't know what to do. Instead, your life has direction, because you figured out how to discern and manage necessity in a manner that gets you where you want to go, and you feel in harmony with yourself and other people, and you feel like you're toward the beauty, the beautiful, the good, and the truth. That's how I think we can start to talk about a notion of freedom that gets above all of the competing freedoms that cancel one another out. When you understand freedom in terms as being free from regret, that is, I think, the freedom one wants to aim for. Freedom from regret.
Beautiful. I like how you summed it up. Put a little
Yeah,
bow
I was
on it
sitting
at
with
the end there. What we talked about in the first podcast was a lot what was coming up here in terms of the infinite finite thing, and in terms of freedom being a sort of infinite value, or there's many different, like it's just like this thing we're striving for, and we can always get as close as we possibly can to freedom, but we're never going to actually get at it, the thing itself, because it's a sort of infinite value. Like we're never, it's like it's just the sort of sun in the horizon. You never actually make it to it. And so I really resonated with what you said around giving it all you got, with like in like that being a form of freedom, right? Because I've thought about this. I don't want to start to open up a whole nother can of worms here, but we talked about the free will thing a little bit, and so I've been contemplating, like, right, if you're born, like no one decides which type of environment they're born into. So you're born into a certain environment that you have no control over, and then that environment inevitably programs you and conditions you in many, many ways. And then you grow up and you become an adult, and like who you are, your personality, what you've done could arguably be something that's actually out of your control, and you were just kind of following, the environmental conditioning, right? And so in that sense, it feels like I like to take this sort of I wanted to bring in a sort of stoic mindset here, which was like, there's a lot of the talk that I read from Stoicism is like, control that which you can control and leave everything else. Like, don't worry about anything else, right? And that feels like that's really good here, where it's like, you've been dealt a certain set of cards, right? You were born into a specific environment. You were conditioned with various good and bad, like good personality traits, good, very valuable things, but also like you've been traumatized in very specific ways growing up, and you've had your own woundings and scars that have shaped your personality in a certain way. And so it almost feels like the freedom would be wake up every day and be able to face whatever hand you've been dealt, good and bad, and then to be able to show up despite how difficult it may be, right? Maybe super difficult. You maybe have dealt a less than great set of hands, or maybe you're struggling. There's a lot of suffering in your life, but actually showing up and actually like facing it without running away feels like one of the deepest freedoms, or at least in my personal experience, when the days that I just show up and it's not a great day, I'm struggling, but I just choose to just face whatever the experience is and not run from it. I think like, on a broad level, like this is my experience. It doesn't matter what I'm doing throughout the day, but like, am I like trying to get away from whatever experience I'm having, in my body, whatever my experience is, like my phenomenological experience. If I'm running away from it, that's like sort of the fear, regret. I would feel regret if I ran away from whatever experience I'm having, whereas I feel freedom and I feel excitement and inspiration and meaning when I just face whatever the phenomena, the qualia of my experiences in any given moment, and then to just be with that, and then to find ways to work with it, and then to shape it in meaningful ways, beautiful ways, to add more beauty to the world by just shaping whatever my experience is and creating something out of it. And so
100%. And you open all the cans of worms you want, because I'm more than happy to go fishing. But what you're saying, I'm really glad you brought that up. I think it is incredibly important that one's metric is what they can control versus not. That is a very important caveat. I personally have never felt regret over something I did not have control over. And I think also that's really important, but that in of itself actually requires that value of discernment and judgment, where you have to judge that I do have control over this, I don't have control over that, and to be really, really honest. And that step right there is actually incredibly hard. because we tend to actually want to claim that the things we do have control over, we don't, and the things we don't have control over, we do, because those are kind of tricks of the ego to escape itself. Because there are all sorts of things we can get into about self-sabotage, you know, where we say I can control X knowing we don't, so that when we fail, we can always come up with a story for why we failed and it's not our fault. We can come up with, say, we actually do have control if we learn the ability to sit and around people different from us and not get mad at us. We like to think that we don't have control over that, because then we don't have to learn to, you know, deal with different kinds of people. You know, so we like to tell ourselves, like, well, it's just my personality. It's just really hard for me to be still. You know, it's like, no, I think you can learn that one. Maybe you have naturally a personality and disposition that makes it more difficult not to show emotion on your face when you hear something you don't like. But it doesn't change the objective fact that, one, when people see on someone's face that they're not in a good mood, that tends to make them not feel welcome. So you probably need to figure out how not to do that, even if you have a natural disposition to express how you're feeling inside, especially if you dislike when the person's giving you their view on politics or whatever, or philosophy or whatever. So that is a skill that maybe is harder from some people to gain versus others. And yet it's very, very dangerous to say that it's a skill that you can't gain, or that it's one that you can't get. Maybe ultimately you could work really hard on it for 5 years and not gain the ability, and you never do, just because of some genetic wiring or something like that. I think it's really important to give it a good go, because even avoiding regret in some situations like that one I just described requires actually some work to determine that you don't control it. And it actually requires really hard work and a real genuine effort to realize that you can't control it. So that, you know, often I think there's a third category in the conversation. So there are things that you clearly can't control, say, such as things you were genes, or maybe economic situation, race, you know, you could be born in discriminatory situations, so on and so forth. You don't have control over that. And that genuinely does limit the horizon that you have. And then there are things you do control, for example. But there's actually a whole lot of things that you can gain control over if you, say, meet the conditions or do some work to get there. And those are the things that are so hard, because then you have to, like, genuinely sit down and go, okay, I don't like to read books. Is that because I'm not able to, like, appreciate books like other people? Or is it just that right now it is, but if I would have put 5 years into it, I actually could get to a place where I'm able to absorb books and to really enjoy them? Okay, I really don't like exercise, but that is because I genuinely say I'm not able to do it like other people? Or is it something that if I worked at for 5 years, I get to the place where I could? That right there, you see, the decision, that right there requires the kind of holding we've been describing, the kind of jump in and say, well, I'm going to give it a shot, and basically try it until you're forced, basically through a kind of Karl Popper falsification, until you're forced to say, okay, no, I'm not going to be a world-class runner. No, I'm not going to, you know, gain the ability to say, you know, control my face as well as maybe some more introverted individuals or something like that. But, you know, here's the other thing. The other thing we got to get out of our head is that we either achieve 100% success or we get no progress. I promise you that if you really, really work on, say, not having a knee-jerk reaction to everything you hear that you dislike, that you will get better at it than you did if you never tried. And that right there is actually a thing of regret, because let's say the best you can do is get 75% better at knee-jerk reactions to things you don't like. Well, then you will regret not getting 75% better at knee-jerk reactions. You will not regret the fact that you didn't get the other 25% to get to 100, but you will regret that you didn't gain that 75%. And so that means you have to try. That means there has to be a lot of trying in life. There has to be a whole lot of trying. That's the thing, is that there has to be a whole lot of trying. There has to be a whole lot of not get the 100%, but knowing that you needed that 75% to not have regret, and a whole lot of also discerning the things in your life that you can try to get better at, and that you should try to get better at. So what does that take us back to? There's no time to waste. There's no time. You need to be thinking now. Like, you need to be examining your own life now, and you need to not be wasting time. There is something to be said about not wasting time. Now, of course, only you know what is wasting time. And wasting time could actually include, say, going to work instead of sitting on your porch watching the sunset, because that is actually escaping the experience of beauty that you need to realize the fullness of time. So wasting time has been captured by, capitalism, basically. So we can't define wasting time by those metrics, but there is a wasting time in the sense of you are not becoming more human. You are not becoming more of the human being that is rising to the occasion of what you've been thrown into. That is very real, and you do not want to waste that time. And one of the ways you may waste that time is your inability to sit silently and still on a porch. So, but what does that require? That requires self-discernment. That requires your own awareness of yourself, and then the judgment that you are not wasting time, the judgment that you are wasting time, the judgment that you can do better at that thing if you try, the judgment that that is worth trying, and the judgment that that is something that you cannot change and therefore would be wasting time to try. You see all of the decisions that have to be made, a kind of decisiveness that has to be integrated. But the problem is, often we think of decisiveness as CEOs of companies and control and oppression. So it's like, oh, decisive in decisions, those are kind of what controlling people do. Well, yes, following capitalism, that tends to be the case. And don't get me wrong, a lot of people who are decisive actually are problematically decisive because they're controlling and they're not open to diversity and so on and so forth. But we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's also a kind of metaphysical decisiveness, a kind of spiritual decisiveness, a kind of individual decisiveness that is really important. There's a difference between legal freedom and individual freedom, we said at the beginning, right? Where there's likewise a difference between a controlling decisiveness and a kind of spiritual directionness. You could also make that if you wanted to use different language, but direction requires choice of going in a direction, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think something that is missing sometimes from the philosophical discussion of, how do we live? How do we overcome the modern, the meaning crisis and different things like that, is the language of, is that sort of, boom, choosing a metaphysical decisiveness, an individual direction that requires risk. It does require risk, but to really give it a go. And to really give it a go after really going through yourself and discerning what you can get better at, what you cannot get better at. And your metric for getting better is not to become a celebrity, but to be more fully human. That's the other thing I should clarify. It's like, okay, so what's the metric of meaning I'm doing, or, that I'm doing this right? What's the metric? Because if you don't have a metric, how can you determine if you're doing everything we're describing right or not? Well, it's certainly not becoming a celebrity because, who knows, that's very random. And a lot of, you can watch Mr. Depp right now with his, Miss Heard. I wouldn't say they're happy, right? There's not a lot of happiness. So it's not necessarily, that's not to say being a celebrity is a bad thing, but it also would be foolish to think that it's a good thing. Obviously, having money could be a good thing, but it'd be foolish to think that it's necessarily a good thing. So the metric has to be being more human. But of course, what does it mean to be more human? Well, if we go into what we're talking about, the true, the beautiful, and the good, and my obsession with apprehension, I think the one, gauge yourself if you're gaining in your ability to apprehend life. If you're gaining in your ability to see beauty around you, if you're gaining in your ability to see the good in people that are different from you, are you genuinely coming to see more good in people that just 5 years ago, for example, you never saw any good in because they were part of the enemy side? Mm-hmm. Are you more able to intuit what you think is the truth? And it turns out it is the truth, actually. Intuition can be trained. Intuition is not something you either have or you do not have. You will actually get better at it. Are you getting better at it? That's not a fluffy thing. That's pretty objective. You can actually measure that with yourself to yourself. Are you becoming more patient? You can measure that. You can remember how you were when you were 5 years ago. And you can also say, well, I'm very patient when there's no pressure, but I'm actually not patient when there is pressure. Okay, we'll see if you can get to the place where you have patience when there is pressure. See if you're doing the things that you talk about. Are you getting to the place where you're able to follow your dreams in a manner that does not ignore reality and takes into consideration other people? Or are you still following your dreams in a manner that justifies you being an egotistical jerk that doesn't care about other people, right? You can tell the difference. Do you speak your mind in a manner that is defending the truth, but also not speaking over people, right? I can go down your list there because your list is outstanding. Those are things you can measure. Those are things you can see if you're doing better at or not. And if you are, then you would have reason to think that you are meeting the right metric, that you are in fact living a life you will not regret, that you are in fact committing to things that you ought to commit for, that you are actually fighting for things that ought to be fought for, that you are making judgments and decisions that increase the beautiful, good, and the true, as opposed to increase oppression and control and things like that. And that you are also rising to the occasion of being thrown into the human, rather than just be caught in a vortex of competing freedoms that you can never figure out how to choose one or to choose out of, so that you can then have the freedom to fully experience yourself and the people around you and what you've been thrown into. That is an opportunity for the good, the beauty, and the good, the beautiful, and the true, if only that you would make the choice to so see it as such.
Yeah, that was really great. That was really great.
You're great.
I feel like I learned a lot from you in these talks.
I love speaking with you. I enjoy speaking. Well, I mean, I appreciate the topics you're talking about that you bring on in your writing or different things. We've kind of come to believe that the way to organize these things is self-evident. Like, oh, you just do what increases freedom. Oh, you just do what increases justice. It is self-evident that freedom and justice are good. It is not self-evident how one organizes them, and how one individuates them, and how one socially organizes them. It is self-evident that the good is good. Okay. But that's like the beginning. That's like base axiom number one. All right. So what now, right? And of course, when you're not surrounded by diversity, you don't have to think about it as much, because the people around you just happen to be in the same range of values. And so even if you don't totally agree and never take the time to even speak about those values, they don't diverge so much that it causes endless conflict. I mean, actually, it still does you'll see conflict in communities, but it's not like, like all over the place, meaning crisis, existential insanity. So as you've moved to greater diversity, globalization, and so on and so forth, the need, it becomes all the more important to realize that it is not self-evident how these things go together and have to be organized. You have to own the process and commit to the process and carry out the process to figure out how they organize. And if we do not, then no, the political situation will not get better. No, the meaning crisis will not go away. No, people will not overcome depression. And you're just going to have a breaking apart of the world into fragments, because the work that you're doing is the necessary work, like writing, to shore the fragments against ruin so that you are not ruined. If this work is not done, then our values will ruin us. It is not the case that values inherently stop ruin. That's what we think. We think if we have values that will stop ruin. No. Values cause ruin if they are not organized. It is better to have values than not, but it is not the case that values cannot cause ruin. Values absolutely cause ruin if they are not thought about and organized. And what is instead, it is assumed that the values are self-evidently valuable. And so the name of the game is just to do them. Well, no, because other people don't accept those premises or the way that you organize them. And actually, the way that you have them organized in situation X is good, but in situation Y is oppressive. Well, the only way to catch that difference is the constant thinking, philosophical, et cetera, which then again, going back to Heidegger, that's why it's consequential if you have cultures of chit chat and not deep thought, because the probability of people rightly fitting the right organization of values in every situation they move between, which are increasingly diverse and different as the world is more diverse, is very, very low. It's just a matter of probability that you're going to get into trouble. And so, now again, that doesn't mean you can't talk about how much you like the new restaurant down the street. And I would like that cheesy Western that they have at the tea room right now, and a bowl of chili walking through the garden. There's a wonderful lingo to this diner. There's nothing wrong with that. But there is also something wrong with not taking ownership of the fact that you're a human being. And that means you need to rise to the occasion. That means you need to think about the occasion so that you don't walk on stage and do the wrong performance at the wrong time. But that would require thinking about what a performance is appropriate at which time and in which way.
Yeah, I love the sort of rise to the occasion feeling. Like that's what I've been getting as you've been speaking all of today. It's just like, striving, really trying, really rising to the occasion, whether or not I remember a quote by Jordan Hall. He says we could rise to the occasion of the sort of meta crisis and still sort of cause like the sort of global extinction. Like there's no reason saying that if everyone rises to the occasion that it still might not be enough. And so like that's kind of what I've sat with is like, it could not be enough. It could like, you could rise to the occasion and still not accomplish what you're hoping for, but it's almost like the necessity of just rising to the occasion feels so important. And yeah, I appreciate you having me on this podcast.
I have enjoyed it. Well,
it was a pleasure.
It is always a pleasure to speak with you. Well, I mean, for me, I kind of associate, freedom is the sunrise, I would say. Sure, maybe the sun will rise and then burn out and blow up and kill us all or something, right? But, the sunrise is the free act, and that's what you want to do. You want to feel like you are rising and creating more and more light, that the light is spreading across your life, not spreading away from your life. You want to feel like you're seeing more, that things are getting warmer. And actually the sunrise, I think the morning is the most beautiful time of day. I mean, right when the sun rises at that 6 a.m. or whatever, 5 a.m., there's this particular beauty that the world will have with the sunrise. And for me, I associate the state of freedom with the sunrise. And I appreciate you being here, Mr. Ethan Nelson. I appreciate your writing. I appreciate the work you do. I appreciate the subjects that you focus on, because they are indeed the ones we need to focus on to figure out how to be more human, how to be more ourselves, and how to be more human with the people around us, so that we can be the sunrise to ourselves, to the people around us, and have the experience of that morning that can be so beautiful. So thank you, Mr. Nelson. I appreciate it very much, sir.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure, sir.